Hi there, I'm John from CNCKing.com, and today we're going to make a business card holder that goes on a desk. When it comes to making custom projects out of wood, there's a lot of different ways of going about producing something. In this case here, it holds business cards, and it's laser engraved on the front and the back. And this was made using CNC router, CNC laser, bandsaw, sander, and a whole bunch of other tools just to get everything to fit absolutely perfectly and to also have something that's really nice and that will last a very long time. There are no nails in this project, there are no screws, it's just glue and interlocking parts. Now before starting a project like this here, the most important thing to keep in mind is what material do you want to use, specifically wood. In this case here we have maple, so many layers of maple as you'll see during the video. I'll just take this thing off here. And at the top we have a mahogany finish, mahogany cap actually. So there are a few different materials we could have used. We could have used oak for this. Oak is a really hard material, just like maple. The disadvantage with oak, at least for this project here, is that you wouldn't have as much contrast between the mahogany and the maple, because oak is generally a little bit of a darker wood. So you'd have like a darker wood with a reddish dark brown wood on the top. Just doesn't look totally perfect. Another option would be to use pine. Pine is very light color, just like this, and would produce a wonderful contrast with the top. The problem with pine is that it's a very soft wood. Maple is very hard. So with a soft wood you don't have a lot of density, and because you don't have a lot of density, this thing would have weighed about half of what this thing weighs, probably even a third. This is actually pretty heavy. And that's what you want, you know, when you have something on your desk, you want something that's wow, and you feel it and it feels like what it should feel like. If I made this thing out of pine as well, it's very easy to ding up. This here is maple. It's very hard to ding up. It's incredibly solid. And I'm very proud of how this whole thing came about. you saw during the CNC routering part of making all the various pieces for this business card holder, there's actually just an interlocking system built into it. And that way I don't need to use screws or nails or anything else other than glue and the wood itself to hold it together. By using tabs, it means that you don't see underneath, like it's a totally clear surface. Otherwise, if you use something that goes all the way through, well, then you got to deal with paint filling and a bunch of other stuff that I didn't want to deal with. And you also end up with a project that's a little bit weaker as a result because you're going through things. Now for this project here, technically our industrial laser, the one behind me here, is strong enough to cut through maple solidly. The reason I didn't use that is because it would have charcoal basically on the edges. Some customers like that, some of them don't. In this case here, I wanted a nice clean finish. And that's what the CNC router allowed me to do. Now technically I could have done it with the laser and then sand everything, but you have to remember this is maple. If it was pine, no problem at all, but maple is an incredibly hard wood and it takes a long time to sand properly. And also whenever you have charcoal, the charcoal builds up on the sandpaper itself. So what you end up doing is having to sand a lot more than you should, just because you're trying to get rid of that charcoal and the charcoal that builds up onto the sandpaper itself. So the next step with this process here was laser engraving the front. Now for the front, all I did was do the panel first and then glue it together. But for the back here, I had to do it afterwards. And the reason for that is because there's an angle to it, and I wanted to have everything perfectly aligned across, vertically, horizontally, everything. And to do that properly, you actually have to have the whole system finished and built. What I really like about this design, again, it's the customer that gave me this design. It's not a design that I came up with. They sent me drawings and said, this is what we want you to make, and that's what we made here at CNCKing.com. What makes this thing deceptively simple is that you actually have an angled on the back here. So this is actually angled up. Now again, if it was pine or any other kind of softwood, that's not a problem. I could have just easily just sanded this to be at an angle. But because it's maple, it's a very hard material, and because it's a hard material, you actually want to cut through it and use that as a jig for gluing afterwards. So in this case here, we have an amazing bandsaw, and I love using my bandsaw. And this is a prime example of why you want sort of old tools with new tools, because it allows you to be efficient. It's like doing this whole project here. Technically, I could have done the whole thing with a router and do the router engraving here as well, but then you wouldn't have anything very sharp for the engraving. And you wouldn't have the darkening. You'd have to do paint filling and a bunch of other steps. So that's why when I built CNCKing.com, I knew that we had to have a really good wood shop, we needed to have a really good metal shop, and we also needed manual tools and CNC tools. Because by using the optimal process for each one, you produce something that's really nice and relatively easier to build than not having the proper tools and trying to sort of Mickey Mouse your way around a project. After I had all the individual little pieces that would make up this finished business card holder, it was time to glue everything up. Now that's where having the bandsaw was actually really nice, because I cut this here at an angle, I was able to use that piece of scrap, flip it around and put it back here so I could actually put clamps and hold everything tightly while everything was gluing. For this project here, because there's a lot of glue on the inside that you don't see here, it takes a little bit longer to dry, and as a result I just let it sit there for about 24 hours just to make totally sure everything dried. Generally dry-ups take 2 or 3 or 4 hours depending on the environment, but in this case here, when you have something on the inside, it takes a while for glue to properly adhere, and you don't want to force something, especially if you're doing a lot of sanding afterwards. If you have something that's sort of glued but it's not totally adhered, then you start sanding and everything starts to fly apart on you. Just like any wood shop, there's no such thing as having too many clamps on a project. I was sort of running out of spots to clamp just because I wanted to make everything totally tight and totally perfect. Because when you make something like this, you don't want to have gaps here and there. There will be some gaps, there's no way around it, but then you just paint fill them or you use wood filler. Now for this project here, after I put the whole assembly together, it was time to engrave the back. Now this was a little bit of a risky thing because if anything happened, I'd basically have to redo the whole project all over again because I'm engraving into the wood. If you notice here, there's some depth to it. Oh wow, the focus actually works this time. And I did 2 passes on it. The first pass does the engraving, and the second pass does a little bit less engraving but more darkening. So that's how you create the contrast built into it. The advantage of using the laser to do the contrast rather than paint filling with a CNC router is that this will never come out, wear out, and when you feel it, it feels really nice and sharp on your fingers. With a CNC router, when you have very fine details, like this eye would have been fine, but some of these sharp little things here, because you're using a round bit, would end up being rounded. Now that's not a big issue, but you know, we have a laser, use the laser for the proper application. The original spec from the customer who drew something out with dimensions that I used to make this project with actually called for using a live edge board. And the problem I had with the live edge is I couldn't find something that was solid like this that I can actually use here in the shop. There's lots of live edge. Live edge is really good for flat areas and that kind of stuff. But when you start going to angular kind of work, it's a hit and miss. The problem is you can get a big thick piece of live edge and then cut it in half and then find some wormholes or other sort of material defects that don't appear on the surface. That's why I went with solid maple that was already a little bit finished, because then I knew what I was having and I was able to see the front and the back of it before doing the laser engraving or doing the CNC routering of the various parts. Now, because the original spec was live edge, this would have actually been curvy, but I told the customer that I think actually something would be even nicer would be to use mahogany top on it to provide the contrast. And it's a nice solid finish, as you can see here. But because it's wood, you want everything to trace perfectly. So what I did is I just flipped this around, traced it on the mahogany, and then cut it out. And it came out absolutely perfect. Something I learned through experience is that it's always a good idea to make things too big and then sand them down, rather than make them totally perfect and then find out, you know, you're just a mil off in X or Y directions, and then you got to redo it again. So in this case here, I left myself a couple millimeters all the way around, roughly 1/8 inch, and then what I did is I started sanding everything. So that's how you end up with a nice, really flush finish. And it actually looks like this is maybe the bark area of the maple, although it isn't. There's absolutely no space in between. After everything is sanded perfectly, it's time to finish the product. In this case here, it was just regular varnish that was applied on multiple coats throughout a 2-day process. Now, as you can see here, there is definitely some shine to it, and that's the varnish. If I would have just left it as is, there would not be any shine. Some customers like that, some of them don't. And of course, after the varnish is finished drying, then you add little feet to the bottom of it, just to make everything nice and even. Although I did sand everything flush, this is a nice way to protect the desk. Maybe it goes on a wooden desk and you actually bang it this way, or whatever happens on people's desks. It's nice to have little feet on it just to protect everything. And now you know how this deceptively easy looking business card holder actually was made. So there's a lot of stuff in here that you wouldn't typically notice if it just sat on a desk. So that's why I like making these videos, because it gives you an idea of all the steps that are involved with making something that's really nice and functional. So if you're looking for custom woodworking, contact me at CNCKing.com.